Hey guys, I'm Duncan. Today I'll be presenting to you Faith and Magic in Early Modern Finland by a woman whose name I can only assume is pronounced Reza Maria Tuiva. Looks like this on the front cover. Yes, it's an ebook. I didn't start on it before we left for Anderson. Um, so when we think of faith and magic in the early modern world, if we're not historians of the time period who've read a lot of books, then what we think of is like Inquisition style witch hunts. But as Reza Tuiva points out, that's not necessarily the case. So I really liked this book. It's a cultural history that's not really afraid to dip its feet into religious political. I guess the best way to say it is that it's a cultural history with a lot of interdisciplinary um, explanations, right? So, for instance, in the beginning, it talks about how Finland isn't really the correct word and that she's using it for convenience sake, right? So, Finland was technically at this time still a part of Sweden, and a better name for it would be the land of the Finns rather than Finland, because Finland didn't exist. And then in another issue, it talks about how when John III got to the Finnish throne, and he started enacting some counter Reformation kind of practices. That dips a little bit into political history, but for the most part, it's a cultural history, talking about how Finnish people understood magic and faith, and how their customs and rituals and practices reflected that and changed over time. So, um, my favorite example to sum up the argument of the whole book is actually this right here. So it's a story about a widow who was sued by her maid. So it happens in 1676. And when she goes to court, she doesn't even change her story at all. She's like, yep, I definitely said, quote, eyes of salmon, eyes of pike, eyes of all fish. Look at my nets in the name of the Father, the Son, etc., and the Holy Spirit. Here it just has, etc. Um, so her maid takes her to court and she's like, you're doing a chant. That's magic and witchcraft. And she says, quote, but do I not mention God too sometimes? Right? So, anyway, so quick summary and background. Finland was actually still part of Sweden at this time, probably better understood as the land of the Finns rather than Finland, because it wasn't a separate country. It was just a separate kind of people, almost like the north and south of the United States, but just one country, right? So southern people are like Finns. Anyway. So the actual seat of government was in Sweden. And so that's where all the institutional policies came when Sweden converted or officially converted to Lutheranism. So all the policies that were made were disseminated up and then translated into Finnish and then came down and were distributed and started being represented in sermons and whatnot. But there was a major disconnect between the official theology of Sweden and then the actual practices of the Finnish lay culture, because Finland is confronted on all sides by three different religions, and they all have their practices and rituals and stuff traditionally. So you have Russian Orthodoxy coming in from Russia, and then you have Lutheranism coming from Sweden, and then Catholicism coming up from northern Germany and Poland. And it makes for a culture which Toiva describes. She says their concepts of faith and magic were formed by competing religious ideologies as a result of religious coexistence, and it wasn't what the historiography, what other historians have described as just like remnants of their traditional past. It's like actually this was really confusing for them. They didn't know what was going on. Luckily for if you're a Finnish woman, however, when they got taken to court, instead of being like, ah, she's a witch, burn her, actually, they were normally, the courts actually, like, they brought the charges down a little bit. So if the maid brings the widow to court and she's like, burn her, the court would be like, I don't know, maybe that's a little bit serious. We'll just charge her a fine of like $50 or something. Not dollars, but what is it? A sum of 50 marks. So then, when John III becomes king of Sweden, and he is more a Catholic sympathizer, And so he starts helping the Counter Reformation in Finland start getting on its feet. Then you have a bunch of Catholic influences, and then they change all the rules again. And then suddenly Lutheran pilgrimages are now magical and superstitious and not the Catholic rituals. Um, and then in Eastern Finland, they had the exact same problem with Russian rituals. So she makes this case that it wasn't like, oh, it was the medieval rituals that were still just sitting around, but it was actually three different distinct religions that were all fighting for dominance, fighting for definitions, fighting for uh, not like actively fighting, but passively fighting, in the minds of the lay people who just didn't know what to believe. She says the Christianization of the region was slow and uneven. So, whereas Turku, which is like not the capital, but because it doesn't have its own government or whatever, but I guess like the urban center of Finland, that's where the Court of Appeals was. Um, that might be heavily Christian, whereas this dude on a farm, it takes him 3 days to get to church. He might still be, like offering offerings to the forest spirits or whatever. Anyway, the book was actually really, really good. I liked it. It was short. It was only like 140 pages, but it was very, very comprehensive. So, for instance, whenever Tuivu needs to talk about the theology that's getting passed, or like this council, right? She'll go into deep detail about it and make sure that you understand before she moves on, and that helps build her credibility, build your understanding of the concept, so that you can follow her argument really easily as you move along. Most of the sources she uses are actually records of the court cases, right? Um, because even if they lie, right, it's a public court, so the audience can vouch for or say, hey, she's not telling the truth. So even if someone was lying in the instance, she had to tell a lie that was credible. And for a cultural historian, that's what we're looking for, right? Because it doesn't matter necessarily as much as if it's perfectly true, as much as it matters if it represents what the crowd would have believed as reasonable and acceptable, right? So it's a good picture, whether it's directly true or not, of what Finnish culture actually was and looked like. I thought that it was a really good book. The English is clear and readable. The organization makes sense and it's really easy to follow. The arguments are well put together. The only real problem that I had, um, or I guess it wasn't even necessarily a problem that I had, but just something that I noticed, is that in American articles, we're used to seeing the thesis as like the last sentence of the introduction paragraph. Um, but it's not like that in this book. Essentially, she says, "Hey, this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is the context you need to know," and then she just starts talking about it. And then her thesis comes as like a culmination of a bunch of mini arguments and the conclusion of her book. And it's not as clear cut as a lot of us would probably be expecting it to be in a work like that. But overall, amazing book. It was really good. I liked it a lot.